What I want to do is talk about health and safety a little bit, sometimes given a bit of a bad reputation maybe. And because we're quite a small group, just ask questions. I was going to throw questions, but probably don't do that. Just ask questions as we're going along. Don't make them too difficult. And we'll see how we go. So this is the law firm I work for. That's me. I'm part of our, I have to say this just in case our PR or marketing departments are going to listen to the presentation later, part of our award-winning health and safety team. We specialise in health and safety defence. We do that proactively, so we do a lot of advice to our clients and auditing our clients on their health and safety systems. If they happen to get into trouble with local authorities or the health and safety executive, then we advise them and assist them through that prosecution process, and I'm the person who, for the most part, goes to court, stands up in front of the judge and tries to get the fine as low as possible. This is the sort of boring bit. You all probably know that every business really creates some sort of risk to workers, to employers, employees, visitors, public, anything like that. Those people that are responsible for running that business own that risk and have to manage that risk as far as reasonably practicable. They're the magic words in most of the legislation. So I'll come on to it in a minute, but what it doesn't mean is you have to do everything conceivably possible to reduce the risk. You just have to do everything that's reasonably practicable to reduce the risk. So you need to assess the risk and take reasonable precautions against that risk. This is the dull bit. So this is the main bit of legislation that underpins health and safety law in the UK, Health and Safety at Work Act. And you can see they have set out the various sections. So you owe a duty, employers to ensure as far as reasonably practicable the safety of employees. Duty towards non-employees, similar thing, not exposing them to risks to health and safety. Individual employees have duties. Putting it in a nutshell, they have duties to work safely and to make sure anybody else affected by their work isn't exposed to a risk. And there are also duties on senior management within any business organisation. Under that, there are lots of regulations. There are too many, but they relate to things like working at height. They relate to sort of dangerous substances. There are regulations about how construction projects are managed, all sorts of things, all relevant to a retail environment. So if you're thinking about what you do day to day, what we tend to say is it doesn't really matter what the business is, what the organisation is, that you know better than anybody on a day-to-day basis where there is risk in what you do. And I don't mean, some dramatic risk. We're talking about anything that risks exposing somebody to a risk against their health and safety. So you need to think about what you're doing day to day, and I'll come on to a bit about that in a minute, and whether there is a risk in what you're doing day to day, how significant it is, and depending on how significant it is, what you need to put in place to reduce that risk. And those are the things sort of practical risk assessment requires. So you've got to have good management in place, because they're the people perhaps at the beginning that will look and assess the risk. You've got to then think about how those people work. So do they have a suitable and sufficient method of working? Are they trained to work in that particular way? Are they supervised to make sure that they are working in the way that they're trained to do? So part of a safe system of working includes things at the end here: supervision, monitoring and auditing. Without that, you don't complete that circle of a safe system of work, because you might say, well, look, this person was trained how to clean the floor. We can show that there was a method in place that they should have followed, and they've done all this refresher training and got every single box ticked. But if you haven't got somebody checking to make sure they're doing the floor cleaning in the way in which they should, then that safe system of work doesn't exist. So I had a little think about in a retail environment, what sort of things might be relevant in terms of health and safety. And I'm very conscious, very near where I live in Suffolk, very conscious that we've got shops but also warehouses. There's a hospice charity near where I live which has a big warehouse. And so there are slightly more challenges, it seems to me, when you're moving into a bigger premises. And from a health and safety point of view, when Ruth was showing her slides about Mighton and that warehouse, my heart was, I was overjoyed to see the result. That warehouse at the beginning, if you have something like that, please change it. Because, you know, from a enforcement point of view, I suspect if somebody from the local authority went into a warehouse like that, they may prevent you using it if it's in that state, because it perhaps obviously showed some risks. So thinking about shops and the warehouses, these are sort of the main areas I would guess that might be relevant. Slips and trips, manual handling, not trips abroad obviously, workplace transport, working at height, and the last one rather dramatically, violence or robbery. I'll come on to that in a bit. So, unbelievably, perhaps, within the retail sector, these are still the single most common cause of accidents. Most incidents occur when smooth, clean floors are left wet, spills are not cleaned up quickly or efficiently, floors are not kept free from contamination, that sort of thing, and trip hazards, leads, boxes, that sort of thing. Some of these are obvious, some of them are not so obvious. Manual handling, it's a big thing recently with the HSE. It's about, you know, training the staff on how to lift things properly. It might sound silly, but there are ways and means of doing that. A bit like how to clean the floor. Everybody might think, well, I know how to clean the floor. But you've got to make sure you have a system in place to make sure they're doing it in the appropriate and safe way. So when it comes to people carrying things, and I guess, you know, we all know that a lot of shops rely on members of the public coming and donating and leaving boxes. You see a big box, you see a big bag, you don't actually know what's in it until you have a little look, or you don't know how heavy it might be until you pick it up. So you have to have a think about what you say to your volunteers, your staff, about how they go about those sorts of things. With all risk, the best way of reducing it is trying to avoid it. So can you avoid actually picking it up? Can you manhandle it in a slightly different way? Can you move it around in a slightly different way? If not, the things you're going to have to think about, such as those sort of set out here, are the tasks sort of involved. You've got to think about the capacity of the person doing it. So if you think about your volunteers in your shops, how able are they? How active are they? What's their age? What's their physical capability? So you might have certain volunteers or staff being able to do some tasks and some not being able to do others because of their own physical capabilities. You've got to think about the load involved. You've got to think about the work environment generally. Are they properly trained on lifting techniques? Are there handling aids that could make it easier for them so you could avoid the risk in the first place? And I think the other thing is, and it's about sort of educating the people, educating your volunteers, educating the staff. Are they aware of the issues that could arise in that particular sphere? So do they know the possible injuries that could come about? This is perhaps relevant, and it's something that I've seen in Suffolk. So this is perhaps relevant to those larger outlets, where there is a sort of warehouse rather than a high street store. And so you might have a car park. So you've got a combination of things to think about if people are coming and parking outside your warehouse at the same time as you might be getting deliveries from people, you might be getting donations coming in, and pedestrians may be also walking in through a shared car park. And the one that I've seen near where I live, the car park is relatively small. And within the car park, people come to park to use the retail warehouse, but they come also to drop off. There are sort of waste bins as well. There's a sort of separate drop-off area, and it's all quite tight and constricted. So you have to think about how you monitor and how you work out how people move around in that space. The interaction between pedestrians and vehicles is something that causes incident and accident all over the place. Yesterday, DHL, big logistics company, were fined £2 million at the Crown Court in Aylesbury for another incident where one of their staff was killed because they hadn't managed the risk in one of their yards. That's a big example, but the point is you have to think about how you segregate potentially pedestrians from traffic. So if you have a parking area where you've got pedestrians and cars, are the car parking spaces marked sufficiently? Is it possible to delineate a walkway for pedestrians that takes them to the edge of the car park so they don't walk through where cars are coming? Is the signage sufficient so when people are coming in, do they know where to park to go into the store as opposed to where they go to drop off? Is it feasible, is it practical to limit the drop-off times for donations? Could they be at the beginning or at the end of the day? Now that we all know is probably not practical, but it might be something you want to consider, depending on the nature of people, I guess, that come in and the number of donations you're getting. If you've got a bigger car park, can you try and put a sign up to at least make sure people don't drive excessively? Reversing. Is it possible with restricted spaces that essentially what you want to try and do is get people to reverse into the space so they can drive away? Is that possible in what you do? You might be familiar with it. You go to a lot of businesses where they have a policy that you have to reverse park. We've had a computer malfunction. It's not my computer, for instance. I'm glad to say. Thank you very much. I think that is because that, we all know that reversing is obviously difficult for some people. And I don't know, but you also might think about the demographic of the people that come to the store and how proficient they might be when they're driving. So do you have what in general sense is called suitable and sufficient? That's a phrase taken from regulation, but do you have a traffic management plan? Do you have a written document that sort of sets out what the risk is and how you're going to manage that risk? So pedestrian getting hit, that's a risk. How have we managed that? Well, we've painted on the side of our car park a little walkway, and we're going to put a sign up saying that's the pedestrian access into the store, and the cars are going to go over there. So at least you've got evidence that you've thought about the risk and managed it. This was the thing that slightly made me cold when I saw Ruth's pictures earlier, those huge piles sort of stacked up. People fall from height in all sorts of businesses all over the land on a daily basis, and it's working at height is one of the things that kills and badly injures a lot of people in all sorts of business sectors. So you can obviously perhaps do things to try and avoid that. Reorganising the warehouse in the way in which they did at Myton is one of those examples, to actually cut out working at height at all. You could use, so if you're thinking about accessing things in a warehouse, step ladders are absolutely fine. They come in for a bit of bad press, step ladders, but they're absolutely fine if you've got a low risk, sort of short duration task. But obviously, if your volunteers are using those step ladders in the course of their tasks, then you've got to make sure that equipment is safe and sufficient. So you've got to check those sorts of things on the step ladder. And you might want to have a register, so you can show, if you need to, that you've inspected it and it is safe. And they've obviously got to be trained. I know that might sound a bit silly because it is just a step ladder after all. You don't train them to make a cup of tea, but obviously there might be some things they need to know about how the mechanism locks at the platform, for instance. And they should also receive some basic training about not what to do. So if you're on a step ladder, this is not what to do. For that reason. So they're simple things. So I think in the context of retail, it's not rocket science, health and safety. It's actually just thinking about what people do. So does one of your volunteers use a stepladder? Have we actually told them how it works properly? Have we checked that the stepladder actually is in good condition for them to use the task? So they're all sort of basic steps. Just think about a risk and how you manage it. Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? I doubt whether, I don't know, you're in a better position to tell me, but I doubt whether the first really applies. That I would hope not, that in hospice retail there aren't many people who get upset enough that somebody has bought the pot that they wanted, the bit of china that they wanted off the shelf in front of them. I can imagine some people perhaps do get a little bit antsy about it, but I would hope it doesn't go, I would hope it doesn't go to that extent. So you have to think about whether that is actually a real risk, or is that something that's going to happen once in a blue moon. And you probably know, if you've got sort of repeated shoppers coming in, your clientele, I expect you see quite a lot of the same faces quite regularly, and you probably know which one might be prone to a sort of violent outburst if he hasn't got what they want. But it may be that isn't too much of a risk, and so you can sort of say, well, we don't need to have any sort of policy in place of how we deal with that. The other one, robbery, I don't know, is something you think about, but sadly in the modern environment, oh dear, bit of a, sorry? Yes, I thought so. It's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? If you're in a cash business, although obviously people now moving away from cash, but again, thinking about the types of people that might come into your individual stores, it may be that some of them still use cash more than cards. So how likely is it? And do you have some sort of written protocol that you tell your staff about how to deal with it, which presumably isn't going to be, face it out and say, who are you kidding, mate? So they know what to do, because that sort of event is a frightening event for them. So it's important that they know and have in their mind before what they do if this unfortunate event takes place. And do you have any sort of procedures? Some of these are fairly obvious and you probably do anyway, but do you have actually thinking about the context of that sort of event, sort of things you could do to mitigate the risk of one happening or mitigate the risk in the event of it? So cashing up in an office out of sight, what security measures do you have in place? What have you told the staff? And also, if there is somebody working alone, so if on occasions you might have a single volunteer, that may be unlikely, but if you do have somebody on their own, is there a policy specifically for what a lone worker does? And that's also important in the context of what they would do in going about their sort of work in the store. You probably wouldn't want them doing some of the things that they could do if there were others in the store sort of monitoring them. These are sort of very quickly sort of other areas. Some of these are very specialised and you'd want some outside assistance for them. Electrical safety, testing products. I know most shops take electrical products, or a certainly limited range of electrical products. If they're defective, obviously make sure people are reporting those. Fire is, as we well know, a separate and specific issue that should be addressed. Health of employees. The HSE have for now, best part of a year, had their Britain Working Well sort of campaign. So they're thinking, and again, it may not necessarily be particularly relevant to your sphere, but they're thinking about the health of people in your working environment and how you sort of help them if there are any obvious issues that they have. And the donations themselves, I would think that some of them aren't always in the best condition, despite the fact that most people try when they donate to make sure that things are clean, they're not broken. They work, but you can imagine that you get a box of all sorts of things, I would guess. So going back to what I was saying about the box or the bag by the door, is there a process that you've told them about how they start looking? Because, who knows what's in there? So glass apt to be broken, I would think, if someone's just dropped a box outside the shop. Things that are dirty, all those sorts of things that are obvious, really, in terms of how they go about it. So, I mean, I think what I would say, if you haven't done it already, I'm conscious, obviously, that a lot of these areas you will have thought about, is actually think about the process. So think about the donation that's outside the front of the shop in the morning. And then think about how your volunteers, your staff, then will deal with that through to a point of sale, and then what they would do beyond the point of sale. And then you can identify the things that you need to think about in terms of risk to them. And it is all in the practice. And if you have policies and procedures, as I was saying earlier, you've got to make sure they're implemented. So you've got to make sure that people know about them, and you've got to make sure that you're checking that they're doing them. And everybody has to be engaged in that. We have one relatively big client in the UK. They're about a £600 million turnover business. They employ 20,000 people in the UK. And they have really embraced the sort of health and safety culture. So everybody from the CEO down to the people that literally do the cleaning in their offices and in their other businesses is engaged to raise any concerns about health and safety. And it's one of the ways in which they've tried to drive the message through their businesses, that it's about everybody. It's about keeping you safe as an individual. It's about keeping the people you work with safe. And they've had great success. Some of these will apply to a lesser or greater degree depending on the sort of size of the outlet. If there are things where you think you could do things better than having a piece of paper, action plan, whatever you like to call it, to show that you've identified that there is something that needs improvement, and how you're going about it is a great way to show people that you're actively and practically monitoring. So we have a little thing, mantra, within our business that was thought of, I think, by one of our health and safety guys some time ago. And it's simple. It's in terms of, you know, your written processes and your policies. So say what you do. So write it down. Make sure you do what you say, and have the paperwork to prove it. And paperwork in terms of training, it's important that the people who are doing the task know how you expect them to be doing it, and make sure they are doing it.